Hi there, so this is just a quick video to show a neat little trick for turning your sound design and samples into even more interesting audio material that you can then chop up and use when you're building your tracks. So I've got a bass sample that I've loaded into Simpler at the bottom here, which is Ableton's kind of basic sampler. There you go. Now what I'm going to do is through a combination of a cool new feature with Simpler, which is now that you can now warp your audio when it's inside the Simpler, and the Max for Live LFOs, I'm going to create this kind of unstable sound generating machine that will then record, and then we can feed that back into the tunes that we're making. Now you can see there's a couple of other plugins on here, but they're not doing anything that complicated. There's just an instance of Camel Fat just doing a tiny bit of saturation because it makes things sound a bit more gelled and kind of glued together, and then a limiter to make sure that it doesn't kind of peak out, which it shouldn't do, to be fair, with Camel Fat, but just in case we want to crank up the volume a bit and squash that dynamic range, we can do that as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to controls, and the LFO in the center here, I'm going to turn the pitch up to 100%. Now this is going to set this LFO off, modulating the pitch, which I believe at the moment we won't be able to hear. Yep. But since we're in beats mode, if I change this to quarter note slicing, we get that quite sort of weird sort of pitching effect. Now this is going to be kind of a bit boring and kind of predictable as it stands at the moment because the LFO is always doing the same thing. So this is where the Max for Live LFOs come into play. So if you haven't got Max for Live, make sure you go and download it from the Ableton Backstage area, and that you grab all of the basic Max for Live utilities bundles that they've got in there as well. And one of those things that will come with it will be the LFO tool. Now you can see that this looks quite similar. If you've used pretty much any synth before, you will have used LFOs which have sort of varying degrees of control. You've got a sort of visual representation of what it's doing up here. There's the rate dial here, as you can see, that slows it down and speeds it up. We've got a depth which kind of controls your range. Phase you won't really notice very much, that's essentially sort of moving it slightly left and right, so we'll leave that pretty much where it is. The offset allows you to nudge it up and down a bit, so the combination of the offset and the depth kind of gives you quite a lot of control over what you're doing with it. And then jitter and smooth, which just allow you to kind of add a little bit of smoothing or kind of noise basically into what's going on, which can sound quite cool as well. So to map this, you can actually map it to, if I just open up the MIDI mapping view by pressing Command M, you can map this to anything that's been highlighted blue now. So as you can see, that's really most of the stuff in there, and that's what makes this really powerful. So I'm just going to click on the map, which is now flashing, and then I'm going to click on the rate for our LFO underneath the LFO there, and you can see it's just started to kind of move it a bit. Now this is going to give us a little bit more kind of unpredictability. When it comes to getting the settings right, I'd say maybe avoid having it too fast, but really just sort of play around, and at the end we'll do a little bit of that once we've got a few more of these LFOs in there. So it's got a little bit more unpredictability in there, but I kind of want even more than that really. So I'm just going to grab this LFO tool here, drop another one in, and I'm going to map that to the frequency on the filter. So that's going a little bit wild now, so let's turn the rate down a bit just to sort of mellow that out. Now depth down a little bit because I don't really want it going all the way down to the bottom, and the offset up so it's kind of more focused on the top bit of the range there. Now a low pass is not the most sort of interesting option in my opinion, especially considering that in Simpler you've got something called a morph filter. So if I click on this filter shape here and select the morph filter at the bottom, you can see now there's an extra dial called morph, that if I turn it, we kind of morph through a few different filter types. So that kind of opens up a few interesting possibilities there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to boost the res up a bit, because that's just going to highlight wherever our filter cut is happening, like so. and I'm going to grab yet another LFO, and I'm going to map it to the morph control. Again, it's going a bit too crazy, sort of going up and down 4 times a second, so I'm just going to bring that down a bit. Bring the depth down a bit as well, because then we can sort of choose which types of filters we might want. So I'm going to say maybe we want it kind of wobbling between high frequencies and low frequencies like that. Let's see how that sounds. Nice. And I'm going to add a bit of jitter in that as well, so we get a little bit of unpredictability. I'm going to add a bit of jitter onto all of them, because why not? Make it sound even wonkier. Nice. Now, at this point, there's kind of a nice, pretty unstable sort of thing going on. Obviously, you can play the sample at different sort of speeds as well, or different pitches on your keyboard. And you can mess around with the rate, depth, and so on. Also, the LFO shapes as well. Let's change a few of these. So you can kind of get quite a lot of different results out of it. You can also experiment with the warp a little bit as well. So I'm just going to do a few of those things now so you can sort of see the variation that we can get out of it. And there you have it. As you can hear, we've basically taken what was a pretty straightforward sort of, a good bass sound, but it didn't really move that much. And if we were recording all of that, we then have all of that saved as a sort of like edit on that bass sound. And really, you can chuck anything in there. You can chuck in old rips from like vinyl recordings. You could chuck in people talking or singing. You could even bounce out a whole bit of your track and put it into that sampler and mess around with it, and then chop that up and put it back in. And you can just save this as like a rack or as a separate project, and you can just keep going back into it and throwing audio into it, and that's just going to give you more and more material to make your music more and more interesting. So there you go. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.